Presbytery of Philadelphia and friends around the region, welcome to our CyberPsalm Café Presby Speak for times such as this, a platform that we've created to gather with one another in prayer and support, and laments as well as celebration. Today we're really excited by our guest presenter, Bob Stice, who will be reflecting on how and why trauma matters. In an effort to move us forward today, I'm going to open us with prayer, turn it over to our tech guru, Greg, who will immediately turn it over to our moderator, Vijay Agrawal. So please join me in prayer. God of resurrection hope, we are so surrounded by uncertainty and all that it causes in our inner selves. Our prayers seem to be endless, full of depth and pain and concern. And yet we are gathered confident that you are hearing our hearts and our spirit. So we pray for all those who were touched by coronavirus, directly, indirectly, Lord, and all the health issues that are complicated by this disease. We pray for the economic impact that has touched so many in so many industries, from food to hospitals to travel and manufacturing. We pray for those on the front line, for healthcare workers, first responders, chaplains, people packing foods and delivering, grocery workers. Lord, you know the list, it is endless. And Lord, we pray for world leaders at every level of government, that they may be filled with wisdom and a spirit that reminds them that they are called to serve the people. And Lord, finally, we pray for all those who have been entrusted with your word, for spiritual leaders and other faith traditions, that it will be you who will hold them close as we together walk through this season of uncertainty. For we are confident, just as those who have gone before us, that behind closed doors, dark tombs, you will break in with your spirit, guiding us to a place where we might lead others into your resurrection hope. Amen. Greg.
Well, good afternoon, Presbytery of Philadelphia. Good to see you both here on Zoom and on Facebook Live. Feel free to give us some likes and some shares to invite others to be a part of this conversation. We're grateful that you're with us on this platform. I want to give you a couple real quick reminders of how to engage. First, if you're on either Facebook or Zoom, you can engage us in the chat room. It would be great for everyone who's here to just share who you are, what church you're representing, just as a way to extend hospitality and welcome to one another. Do that on both platforms. That will also be our space for engaging in questions and comments and resource sharing throughout the conversation. We will be doing a lot of the Q&A towards the end after Bob shares, as well as our panelists. So as the conversation goes, you have plenty of time to share with us some of your questions and comments, even experiences. And then towards the end, we'll pull a few of those out to engage depending on the amount of time that we have. Again, we are just so grateful that you're with us. And if you have any questions about how to navigate these platforms or whatnot, feel free to post them there or reach out to us. And our prayers are with you as we continue to do this work together. So that said, Mr. Moderator, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. This is a situation that impacts us all in very strange and unusual ways. And I think today's topic is especially timely, whether we're in pastoral leadership, elder leadership, other leadership positions in our community. I think especially at a time of stress and strain, leaders bear that very often in silence, but very often it's, they say it's lonely at the top. And I think that's especially true in these times. So we're really privileged to have Bob Stice joining us today from the Credo program. Bob is on the faculty of the Credo, which is a tremendous program run by the Board of Pensions, even in normal times, to provide support, spiritual guidance, and counseling to our pastoral staff, but also and especially in times like this, especially important, especially grateful that Bob is willing to take a few moments out of his day to be with us. In addition to Bob's work with Credo, he's also he is a a licensed professional clinical counselor, and serves on the faculty and staff of the University of New Mexico Hospital, which is a level 1 trauma unit in Arizona. So Bob gets feedback both pastorally and professionally from people who are experiencing trauma and mental strain during this unusual time. We're also happy to be joined today by 3 excellent panelists, Carla Jones-Brown from Arch Street, Tom Summers, chaplain at Rydell Park, and Steve Morganti from Concord Liberty. So they'll be asking questions at the end of Bob's presentation. And with no further ado, Bob, I turn the virtual podium over to you.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to share a little time with you today. I bring you greetings from New Mexico, actually, in Albuquerque, which is home. And I welcome you to visit here anytime you get a chance. Some of you have probably experienced Ghost Ranch, which is a pretty well-known Presbyterian retreat out in this area. And I invite you anytime that you come through our part of the country to please give me a call. I would love to be able to host you and share some time with you. I'm delighted to take time out of the schedule today to just be able to share a little bit with you about trauma. And we'll share with you where I come from, even though I've been in the clinical world now for a lot of years. And presently here in Albuquerque, I'm CEO and clinical director of a pretty large behavioral health agency that is the mental health provider for the University of New Mexico Hospital, which is our Trauma One Center here in this state. So our staff, as you know, and probably you experience where you are, is very busy, a lot of hours a day these days, responding to staff, medical staff and support staff at the hospital, and to being able to support those people, including the chaplaincy program. I know, Tom, that's your area. And I will share with you personally, I give you my highest regard and support to all of you who are clergy, as well as the ones on the chaplain staff, because you know as well as I do, clergy are a type of first responder and primary care type person out here. And I know from my own experience and from working with clergy across the country with Credo, this is also a very stressful time. I'll share with you I'll take just a very brief period of time to share with you a little bit. I have to make a confession to start, and that is I was born and raised in Texas, which for some people demands a confession, I guess. Not only that, I was born into a Southern Baptist family. And that was because if you're born in Texas back in those days, the odds of you being born into a Baptist family are much greater than being born into a Presbyterian family or any other type. But I feel the need for some reason these days to always say, but you know, the Baptist group that I was a part of was normal back in those days. And that was my background, and I had a strong sense of calling out of that time to ministry, and probably was indicative of kind of my own personality even back then. Because then if you were a Baptist in Texas and you decided to go to seminary, it was almost ordained that you went to Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas. And I immediately announced to my family I was going to Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, which was like going to a foreign country, you know, for people at that time. But I share this with you because at that time, and some of you may know the history there, Southern Seminary in Louisville was by far the most progressive and intellectually based of the Baptist seminaries. And when I got there, I was blessed to have as my mentor during seminary days a person who perhaps some of you have known or have read through the years, a guy named Wayne Oates, who was, strangely enough, teaching in the medical school at Louisville, and was also on the faculty at the seminary. And so for me, in the shaping of my calling, that was my first experience with the fact that these two disciplines of theology and good psychological care could actually merge. And that became a part of my formation as I went on. Through the years, my calling kind of shaped itself away from the local pastorate within my particular denomination at the time, and went more in the clinical side. But I will tell you that after all these years in the clinical world, I still very much have a sense of everything that I do today, regardless of what the setting is, I see as a part of my call and expressing my call and living out my call. So through all of that, through the years, I've been privileged to be a part of the Credo experience. First being a part of the Episcopal Credo, which is where the program was really developed and formed. And then as the Presbyterians joined, and I was a part of being able to help train some of that faculty. And then over the last several years, actually migrated to be accepted as an honorary Presbyterian, or honorary, as some of my colleagues would say, with the Presbyterian Credo. And I'm very proud to be a part of that and to share with that. All of that said, I would rather us, I don't know that there's an expert of any kind about some of these things. I think we're all kind of our own expert in terms of what we're doing. And so I would rather use the time, I think, to more in the light of us being able to have a conversation about trauma and about how that really impacts what's going on. And so I'm saying that to say that we could spend days just talking about the whole clinical aspect of trauma. But what's more important is that trauma, as people are experiencing now, is something that every person is experiencing. And so when we talk from a clinical standpoint, as I'm sure some of you know in your own training, I mean, certainly there is a clinical diagnosis related to trauma, or a whole continuum of diagnosis related to trauma. And in a very simple sense, it is a pretty serious psychological, emotional reaction to a very strong event or series of events. And in the clinical aspect of that, the diagnostic aspect of that, there are a number of different kinds of diagnoses related to trauma. One of the most popular ones that people think of when they think of trauma is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And interestingly enough, in the real trauma world, PTSD has kind of become a catch-all to a lot of people. We do a lot of work also out here in terms of working with the VA hospital and working with veterans and their families. And it has developed over the years, as I'm sure some of you have experienced, maybe in your own family. You mentioned PTSD, and immediately people think about our veterans returning from conflicts and areas around the world with injuries experienced in the wartime, and they come back experiencing this post-traumatic stress kind of disorder. And that is certainly true. However, it has become almost just a generalized expectation that if you return from a conflict somewhere in the world, then you must have PTSD. And we've actually worked with some veterans and their families who do not have that experience and actually have to deal with kind of being, categorized that way. So trauma itself, I would rather kind of put in the context of it is how we respond to just what happens in life, and to the definition of everything that comes along. Families experience trauma, individuals experience trauma every single day. You know this as pastors. You work with them in terms of serious illnesses, all kinds of traumatic events, deaths, financial collapse, financial difficulties across the board. These are trauma events. And I think it would be good for us to just kind of think in terms of trauma, not in so much of a clinical definition, but in terms of how it is that we cope and how do we react to these life events that come along. Interestingly enough, if any of you are clinically inclined, then you probably know that the Bible in the clinical world is something called the DSM-5, which is what we go by to, put labels on things, which we have to do for some reason. Interestingly enough, I just point this out. Interestingly enough, under PTSD, one of the characteristics that is detailed in the DSM is that one of the characteristics of PTSD is that you can be exposed to or observe or experienced many times vicariously a traumatic event or some serious disaster event going on. And they actually list in the DSM-5, which now, after this pandemic we're going through, is probably going to have to be kind of revised, because they have in there, except if you are constantly experiencing these events through media or through reports that happen on media types of outlets and this type of thing. Well, you and I both know that going through the COVID experience, that's becoming a part of the trauma reaction that everybody is living with, because we are being bombarded every day, all day long, with information about the virus and all the things that are happening and numbers, and you could go ahead and add to that. I would rather us just kind of look at how do we react to, how do we respond to, and so the other side of that, which is something that actually we're privileged to talk about in Credo a lot, in my area in that, is the whole idea of resilience. So I would just toss out for you for your own, just kind of for your own thinking, that we can develop a little bit. In looking at resilience, one of the things that I do in a Credo conference or a classroom where we're talking about resilience is that I will ask people to think back to a time in their life, some experience in their life when they were facing stress or difficulty, and a part of that process was that they were not sure how they were going to survive. And actually really kind of think back and put yourself back in that place. And then we come forward a bit and say, obviously we all survived because we're sitting here talking about it. So I want you to think back about, as you went through that experience and you came out on the survival end, what were the things that helped you get through? What were the factors that helped you survive? And things that people many times toss out have to do with, well, it was support, it was relationship, it was my spiritual faith, it was learning how to just do simple things to take care of myself, how to get different perspectives about life. Strangely enough, one of the factors that people toss out all the time has to do with humor, which is about how we just put into perspective what's going on around us. Those kinds of things that become factors of resilience, of survival after experiencing a traumatic kind of event. And I was thinking, as I was just putting some of this together, the interesting thing is with where we are today is that COVID actually combines nearly all of these factors. We're dealing with illness, we're dealing with threat of death in many cases, we're dealing with economic and financial kinds of disaster, we're dealing with all kinds of fears about what's going to happen next. How are we going to get back to whatever a new normal is? I think we are in the heart of an experience in a lot of ways unlike we have gone through before. And so this is the trauma that everybody is living with. And it has the same characteristics as trauma in terms of how we respond. So one of the common sense things that I would toss out just for your thinking also. This is true in trauma reaction. Same as it's true with almost any strong stress reaction that we all go through in various times in life. When we experience stress, trauma, whatever those events may be, for the most part, our basic personality functioning does not change. Someone who tends to be anxious normally, and just in terms of how they deal with life, when they are facing a traumatic event or stressful event, that anxiety level just intensifies. It's very seldom do they develop a whole new kind of pathology. Same thing is true on the opposite end. You may know some people, maybe one yourself, that the way that you typically react to stress or a major stressful event is that you really need to shut down or you need to kind of withdraw. And when that happens, and when somebody's facing a serious event, that reaction just intensifies. And so I think it's important to point that out, because we're really talking about how every person has to find ways to cope with something which just seems almost unmanageable. And our personalities really just kind of increase in terms of our functioning skills. Now you combine that with when we're dealing with sheltering in place, the social distancing. Now we have all of our personalities, whether it's with a family or if it's with a group. Now all of that is happening within a confined space. And I will tell you, and I'm sure you're experiencing this there, in a clinical world, one of the things that all of our staff right now clinically are starting to experience when this happens, then there are a couple of factors which are pretty serious that start happening in the society. Domestic violence cases go up, child abuse cases start to go up. All of these kinds of dysfunctional behavioral responses start to intensify. I'm sure you have these experiences and you are trying to address them all the time. One of the really very serious and, if you will, traumatic kinds of situations that we are dealing with almost daily is if there is a person who is living in a relationship that tends to be abusive, potentially violent, and that person is now really kind of trapped within this physical space of being at home and no way of getting out. If you stop and think about it for a moment, for that person who is potentially a victim to actually even take a step to call to get help or to seek help in some way actually triggers a greater danger. And so they actually are finding themselves trapped in a very difficult situation and no way of trying to reach out. So this is happening within families, and I emphasize probably the extreme of it, but it's something that I think is going to be something we deal with as a trauma reaction for a long period of time. So I just kind of toss that out, and we could look at more, I think, in terms of trauma. Why does trauma matter? Well, it matters because it's a part of life, and it's a part of life that we all experience, and yet it defines so much about how we function and how our relationships function, how our families function. And the other side of that, which I'm sure that you all as a group are addressing, or certainly will be addressing, is that it's not just individual trauma, an individual kind of response. There is a corporate trauma that goes on and an organizational trauma. And I think the church, whatever manifestation that is, the church is also having to seek what it's going to look like to kind of move back into the new normal, because I think that the impact is there certainly in the corporate level too. You look at every area of our society right now, educational programs, corporate business programs, all kinds of organizations, Everybody is going to be trying to figure out, how do we survive? How do we rebuild? What do we learn? All of that comes under the category of dealing with trauma. So I just kind of tossed that out because pastors especially are many times the ones that with people who are your members and parishioners, you are the primary contact. And when you yourself are trying to just survive, deal with your own situation, maybe with your family or your relationships, whatever that may be, you are put in the same kind of situation as all of the caregivers out here are. And in that regard, I appreciated the comments earlier, because we certainly receive all the time and give out the appreciation for the people on the front lines and doing this type of thing. And I will share with you, and I express this every day, people, I think that clergy and the people who are working on those staffs are absolutely on the front line. And in that regard, have to pay attention to how do you respond and how do you react. So there are some common things about trauma that I think is just important to put on the continuum. And it may be more accurate to talk about, when we're talking about trauma in these times, it's probably more accurate to kind of think about the entire continuum of reaction. Trauma is there. We're being inundated with that. I heard for the first time this morning, I was just waiting for this to happen, but this morning, I heard for the first, we have now this new official phrase, which is called quarantine fatigue. And I think that's a very real, that'll have to get added into probably the DSM-5 or whatever the next level is at some point. We are all experiencing this. So it's on that continuum, and even on the trauma continuum, we can certainly look, and you're familiar with at the clinical extremes and the pathological extremes of all the different kinds of trauma reactions. But it's important to see that as a continuum, because even within the diagnostic realm of trauma, we move into something that is called adjustment reaction, which is also a diagnosis. And that is also how a person is experiencing some changes in behavior, changes in daily living, many times changes in how they sleep, eat, process information, how their mood changes, how they start to feel like they are not functioning at the level that they want to. Mental functioning many times changes. We get overwhelmed. There is something, and probably, I'm sure that many of you experienced this too. My life has also been involved very much through the years in the cancer world. And I lived in Houston for about 23 years before I came to New Mexico. And a part of that time, among other things, I was on the staff at MD Anderson, the cancer hospital in Houston. And in a lot of the work with cancer families and with cancer patients, we've often referred to this phenomenon called chemo brain. When somebody is going through a chemo experience, there is this, sometimes our mental functioning, gets really kind of compromised, and we can't handle things the way that we always have. I personally have gone through that, even in addition to professionally, in that 2 years ago, I lost my soulmate of many years due to cancer. And we talked all the time during that. And I came up with this whole idea during that chemo brain is one of the things about cancer, one of the few things about cancer that is contagious, because the caregivers can also end up with chemo brain. It's how our daily normal functioning at any level tends to change in reaction to the stress or the reaction to the trauma. And that's where I think that we have to have some kind of common sense, because if you have family members, who are experiencing different kinds of levels of functioning, or maybe some kind of impediment in the way they normally handle things. And I certainly know, because I get involved in these conversations too, just like you do. Our whole spiritual development, spiritual life during this time also faces a lot of questions. At a time when we as believers believe very much in the concept of God's provision and God's presence with us. When we talk about love being something that casts out fear, and yet we're finding ourselves encountering thoughts almost every day of fear about what's going to happen, whether it's physically, medically, threat of losing someone close to us, threat of being sick and losing our own life, whatever that may be. And we are faced with that normal reaction, which can be fearful in a lot of ways. And we sometimes then say, well, where is our faith in the middle of all of that? And I think that's that extra kind of pressure from a counseling standpoint on a clergy, on a pastor, because people are looking to the clergy for during these times to be able to kind of help them walk through that path and look at that. And I think that one of the other things that's just practical that I would toss out, and then it'd be interesting to see how you guys are handling it and what things that you have to teach all the rest of us too. One of the interesting things in terms of trauma reactions and recovery, and how does someone put their life back together and start to rebuild, or as we certainly toss out all the time, there is no such thing as a return to normal. It's going to be a new normal of some kind. For individuals as well as institutions. And I think the church is certainly going to be looking at that same kind of recovery. What is it that we learn? And the interesting thing is, as you know, we're having this conversation right now through Zoom or whatever the media might be. That's something we would not have been doing, 20 years ago. My oldest daughter is a Methodist minister in Austin, Texas, at one of the larger Methodist churches there. And so she's very involved. Their church is very involved in the streaming of their services every week. And we have conversations about what that's like for the pastors, as probably I'm sure some of you know, because pastors, and I can speak from this standpoint too, it's a totally different thing if you're standing up at a lectern or whatever that may be and delivering a sermon or a message to an empty building, rather than being able to connect with those people that you normally are there for. And so I think that the interesting thing is we are probably learning, as people do in response to all kinds of trauma in their lives, we learn through survival that there are perhaps some new things that we can learn to do. And there's some things that can make it better. And I think a lot of this, how we're having to deal with things virtually, can perhaps be ways of enhancing however we recover. So I think it's being aware of, there's nothing complicated about trauma. That said, from a professional standpoint, I don't want to minimize it all, that trauma reactions, depending on situations, can certainly become very serious and need to be addressed that way. And I think one of those things, because again, clergy can be the primary care kind of receiver for those situations, and for you to have your own self-care routine, and also being able to know when is the appropriate time to refer those kinds of situations, which can certainly become life-threatening too if a person is depressed and feeling those kinds of things. But it is looking at how this impacts normal functioning. And so all of us, I think, are experiencing trauma reaction. And the matters about trauma, these very things that impact how we cope with situations. And I think, and this is just certainly my own opinion, which is not worth a whole lot, But I think one of the things this is pointing out, obviously, that especially in places in our country and maybe in our culture, we're recognizing in some extent how we have been pretty much taking for granted a lot of daily life and daily things. And I don't say this with humor, although there is still something very humorous about it. Who would have guessed that one of the top headlines about this trauma reaction would involve toilet paper? But that's part of every kind of headline that comes around. We also are experiencing, I think, how perhaps we have kind of become entitled in the way that we have become used to functioning. Even though, as you know, and I think the church certainly is and should be one of those institutions in our culture that is sensitive to the fact that even when there's provision for a lot of people, there are many people in our country, different levels of our society, who live their lives almost every day at this level of worry about what they're going to lose and where they're going to get support. So I think that if we kind of see it in terms of not some kind of pathological sense about trauma, but the fact that it is how we are responding to life and how we're dealing with fear, how we're dealing with emotions that we tend to not like to talk about a lot, anger, guilt, fear being certainly one of them. This becomes, it's almost like an open classroom every day that we're living in. That said, I would just toss out, because I know that we're going to run out of time. But when you talk about, so what do we do about it? And there's nothing brilliant about all of this. It's just common sense. I hate to bring this up, but nonetheless, it comes up in every kind of stress management approach that we do. But it is this whole thing about self-care. And as providers, whether it's as clergy or mental health providers or medical providers, responders, whatever it is, the most unselfish thing that we do for our families or for our parishioners is to take care of ourselves. And it's the old, as you know, it's well used and well worn, but it's the old analogy of the oxygen mask dropping down in the airplane. And all of us have probably gotten used to ignoring those, examples and talks that the flight attendants give. But the thing that always is there that still strikes me is that when they're doing their demonstration and the oxygen, they say, if the oxygen mask drops down because we have this sudden loss of pressure, et cetera, then here's what you need to know. One is, and this is totally unrelated, but I still haven't been able to grasp this concept. They say, so trust us because you will be receiving oxygen and just breathe normally. Well, breathing normally is kind of contradictory to trauma reaction when we're in the middle of all of that. But the second thing is, and if you are with someone who, needs your help, then you put your own mask on first. And that's that simple concept that as caregivers and providers, if we do not take care of ourselves, we are then not going to be able to provide that support and that care, whether it's with family, whether it's with congregations, whatever it may be. And so whatever your method of self-care is, it's an extremely important thing, whether it's if we're at home, wherever that may be for you, that you practice all of those things mentally, emotionally, spiritually, whatever that is, because that is the strongest, trauma reaction model that we can give to those people who are around us. So I would like to just kind of, one of the things that I toss out, and perhaps you have too, but when we're talking about families going through things, and we stuck right now, every part of the country, we are, and I'm sure that you are there where you are around Philadelphia. We're all just kind of sitting, waiting for, okay, what's the reopening plan here? And that's also creating its own kind of trauma event, stress event for everybody. But when we're looking at that, I think it is a common component of trauma reaction, trauma recovery, or label it adjustment to stress, whatever we want to do, is that we can't wait for there to be a time when suddenly this is resolved, or suddenly we are in this new normal. Our experience, whether it's mentally, emotionally, psychologically, I would add in spiritually, our experience is how we apply that right in the middle of the storm. How we learn to do that every day in the middle of the stress that's going on, and how we share that with other people. And so I will kind of close with that. Most of you know there's one of the best known kinds of quotes that I think has ever existed. Comes from a writer named Vivian Green, who has, and there's posters about this everywhere, who has said, life is not about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. Life is not about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. And we are right in the middle of kind of an increasing kind of situation where the storm is around us every single day. You experience it, people you work with are experiencing, your own family experiences it. We've got to be paying attention to, in the middle of the storm, how do we reinforce those ways of dancing and getting other people in the dance with us? Because that's where the real coping and adapting to any level of trauma, can be. So I would just kind of hope that some of those things would spark some thoughts for you. And I'd be happy to try to address that in any way I can.
Great, Bob. Thank you so much for those insights. We have 3 storm dancers on the line right now as a part of our panel. So maybe we can go first to Tom Summers and give us some of your thoughts about how you've seen this play out and what your reactions have been, Tom.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all very much. And Bob, thank you for all your comments. I really did appreciate the wisdom you brought to us today. I serve in a unique way. I'm the chaplain at Rydell Park. It's one of our Presbyterian retirement communities up in Abington Township. We have right now about 500 residents full-time living there, and about 480 team members on our staff. And every single one of them has been deeply affected by this whole process. I also serve on the faculty out at the University of the Sciences in Philadelphia. I teach a course there on death and dying. Mm-hmm. And right in the midst of the beginning of the second half of the semester, I think March 13th became a transitional day in my life and the life of the people around me. On that day, the university made the decision to stop all classes and everything goes online. Everything changed at that point. At Rydell Park on the same day, we stopped all programming and asked our residents to isolate. Dealing with people in community has been, I think, the hardest part, because the community has been put asunder. Here at Rydell Park, everybody is in their own apartments. We're asking them not to leave their apartments. We're asking them not to go out. And this is very difficult for them to do. My college students all had to leave the university. They had to go back home to be with their parents. They had to come up with a plan to go someplace to live. And all of a sudden, they're all out there and isolated and alone and everything. And I think one of the things that has happened, and a couple of people mentioned this as we were going through and I was watching the chats. One of my difficult aspects of Rydell Park is about half of my residents there are Jewish. And in Judaism, as you all may be aware, when there is a death, the burial has to take place immediately. Mm-hmm. One of our residents died on March 13th. I am still working with her husband because he is absolutely devastated by the fact that he can't even have a funeral service for his wife. Since March 13th, we have had 18 deaths. including 6 deaths just this past Sunday. Out of that whole period of time, I was able to do 1 funeral service in a cemetery in Philadelphia, and only 5 people were able to attend, and we had to be spaced out so we could be safe and protected with each other. And what it has done to our sense of community and sense of belonging has been very, very difficult, and we struggle with that all of the time. We have residents now under quarantine because they have tested positive. We have staff members who have tested positive and no longer can come to work. We're being a part of the management leadership team at Rattle Park involved in scanning everybody that comes into the building, checking their temperatures, checking their pulse ox, asking them all kinds of questions about their lifestyle, what they've been doing. It has been wearing on everybody.
Yep.
And one of the things that we're working on right now, and I'll be dealing with this tomorrow, is we're trying to figure out a way that we can start doing something to have a memorial service for our residents who died. We've had a lot of those deaths, and we really need to be able to honor that and deal with it. And yet at the same time, and I love the comments about resilience, because we are going to be doing things to help people build up their resilience. Kevin asked me in private as things were getting started. Tomorrow is going to be a very special day for us at Rattle Park. One of our residents who Kevin knows very dearly, she is one of the sweetest people I have ever met in my life. She turns 100 years old. We're having a birthday party for her. We have her family showing up out in the parking lot. They're going to be spaced out so that they're at least 6 feet apart. Irma is Scottish, and so we have a bagpiper coming to play for her. And of course, I will go in full regalia in my kilt and take along my fiddle and play some Scottish music for her tomorrow as well. We're doing these things to rejoice, to have celebrations, to remember that we're still community. Yeah. And even more importantly, I think, one of the things that have been popping up there is we are trying to show that we are all in this together and that we are trying to help and support each other. And that, for me, is, I think, what is beginning to really help us get through this very difficult time in a very difficult place. I've been trying to do the same thing with my students and trying to keep in touch with them, including a couple of students that have tested positive. It's a real worry. But I think we can hold each other together. We can hold each other up. Mm-hmm. And I'm using my faith. One of my things is when I go out to work every day, and this has been a part of my practice throughout all of my time in hospice care and now working in chaplaincy at Rattle Park, I start off my day with a simple prayer. Lord, I have no idea what I'm going to see today, but be with me and put me where you need me to be at this time. And that seems to be making all of the difference. So thank you all for being a part of this. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Great, thanks. Carla, you had a great quote in the chat room. Trauma is just how we respond to events in life. Maybe you can give us some reactions and maybe even expand on that thought.
Thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I think I was quoting the speaker in that moment, but I do really appreciate this is about how we are able to respond to particular events. And what that means for me as a pastor is being very clear about what are my limitations? What are the things that I can and should not respond or react to in the moment? The first 2 or 3 weeks, my response to everything was eat a chocolate donut. Week 4, I tried to put on a pair of pants that didn't fit. And so that changed my response. But it will change every day. And I think that's the piece that is creating additional anxiety for some people. You never know what you're going to have to respond and react to on any given day. And for the control freaks among us, that can be a huge challenge. I was in a conversation and someone mentioned, and I think it was on Facebook, that this was like being in a car accident. And my response to that is, I was actually hit by a car 2 years ago. And The difference then was there were only two people. There was myself and there was the woman driving the car who hit me. This is like being in a multi-car pileup where everyone has been in an accident and you can't tell the help from the hurt. So in taking the temperature of the team, so Arch Street has wonderful deacons, and some can serve some days and some need to take a break other days. We have wonderful elders. Some can respond certain days and some are just like, yeah, Carla, catch me next week because this week it's not going to happen.
Sure.
I think regardless of how we respond, being able to communicate and name what it is we're feeling or what it is we're struggling with. If it's anxiety, great. You know what? I'm not a certified counselor, so I'm going to refer you to someone who can help you with that.
Sure.
You're stressed out and you want to FaceTime with someone and eat sweets, and I'm your girl. I got you. I have had tea dates with friends of mine who will just call and say, can we just be on the phone and have tea together? And I'm going to take notes. I'm going to work on my sermon.
Sure.
All right. It helps to get rid of some of that isolation. So there are some healthy responses, I think. And if we can collect and disseminate those, and people can pick, choose, and refuse. What works for one won't work for everyone. I don't recommend the donut diet for everyone.
Right.
But finding the things that will work and just using those. And know, again, I love Tom's. I wish Tom could type his prayer in the chat room so we could borrow that.
Yeah.
You never know what the day is going to bring,
Right.
but you have to trust that you do have some equipment, you do have an oxygen mask to at least get you to
Absolutely.
be able to find what will work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very good.
Thank you, Carla. That's great. Steve, can we turn to you for some reactions?
This has actually, leading up before this, I don't want to say too much right here, but there's some great deal of personal trauma that happened in my family. And then this hit like about a week and a half after this whole thing with coronavirus. And so I was reeling already when this hit, and I found myself in a not sure up from down. Unlike Tom, my prayer was more, I believe, help me in my unbelief. And that was what I kept coming back to in everything, constantly. Lord, I know you're here, but where? Show me how. I don't see it. I want to know. And I feel lost. It was a lot of what that was and felt like for me. So to by God's grace, to rally and to actually be able to preach a sermon that was recorded and sent, which is so unlike me to want to even do that at all. Most people are shocked to hear that I'm very much an introvert, and so to be a pastor and an introvert sometimes can be a challenge. But at times, like right now, it actually makes it a little bit easier than it could be in some ways. But the reality is to have that trauma right before all this hit for me, and to be barely able to name that and to identify that and to work my way through that has just added a layer upon layer upon layer with all this, and it's been. To put it mildly, it's been hard. The coronavirus doesn't frighten me. I mean, I've turned into Adrian Monk. I wash my hands and I ask for a wipe all the time, I feel like, but that's besides the point. The reality is that part of it didn't unsettle me as much as the personal trauma that we felt as a family. And then just adding this on top, knowing that ideally in the end, that God will do something through this. Is the hope that I keep coming back to, the source of joy in it. And I have really found myself stretched in my ability to be thankful as well in the midst of all this. And just, it's not hard to wake up in the morning to see my beautiful children right there. They don't sound beautiful coming down the stairs when I'm sleeping, but when they're there and they smile and they're just, there's that overwhelming sense of thankfulness for the people in my life and for the way that God has used them and will continue to use them. But I keep coming back to, I believe, help me in my unbelief. And that's been a very, very big deal to me. And I personally, Bob, I'd like to hear you say more about this quarantine fatigue and how you think, going forward. You've mentioned self-care, but what are some of the other ways that we can maybe get ahead of it and try to help people before it really, really heavily starts to settle in? I'd like to hear more about it. I'm very intrigued by the term, and it makes sense. But if you could speak to that a little bit more, I would personally appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great observation, and I think that so so you just stop and think about the word fatigue by itself, and what does that mean? When we are experiencing in any other level something that we would call fatigue, what happens? Well, in simple terms, if we look at that, our immune system, tends to get compromised. We don't get the right kind of rest. Those things that kind of keep our energy level functioning, even in the middle of challenges and middle of stress. I know it sounds a little bit simple, but eating well, sleeping well, exercising, and the interesting thing is, and I'm sure that you all are discovering this too, people are coming up with amazingly creative ways to be able to try to normalize keeping up with these kinds of functions. But I think the emotional part of that, which I would just toss out, and there's probably some in fact, one of the things that I would be glad to do is after we're done with this, I'd be happy to, send out just some links. There are links everywhere, but some things that we're finding that are being helpful, to work. But it's maintaining, and again, it's finding ourselves in the middle of the emotional storm, ways to just maintain normal kinds of energy. And there's everything works against that. You mentioned the thing about being in it. It's interesting because when I was talking about things just get intensified, and introverts, I happen to be one myself. We depend, for us to stay energized, I depend on being able to get away from people and have my time. When I'm, when you can't escape, then there's not that way of replenishing. Extroverts depend on being able to be out there energized and interacting with people to get kind of re-energized. So their level of balance, so we have to find, kind of many ways to do it. I referred back, and I'm trying to be aware of time here that I know you have. One of the things that I learned from Wayne Oates back in those days, Wayne, and many of you probably have read this book. One of his classic books was called Nurturing Silence in a Noisy Heart. And one of the things that he talked about is the fact that as professionals, we kind of depend on, okay, next October, I'm going to get a week's vacation. And so I'll be able to kind of and so then we just don't pay any attention day by day to taking that. And he created this idea called mini vacations, where I plug in, if I've got 10 minutes here, I actually take a break, or actually kind of mentally will go into that place, doing it. So I think it's not about trying to find new ways of doing it. It's finding creative ways, the things that keep our fatigue level, from getting overwhelming. We work at doing that within our normal environment, and so there's
Bob,
some ways. Yeah,
I might just interrupt for one. We are running very short of time, and there's a lot of really, really great questions on the chat room. I'm gonna ask everyone's indulgence for one more question. It's a 1-minute answer. It's a complex topic, but a 1-minute answer. As pastors and as pastoral leaders, we're all going through our own trauma. How do we deal with the guilt that comes with not being able to do more for people who are in trauma when we're having trauma and issues of ourselves? Just if you could be brief, because we are over time.
Yeah. Oh, sure. No, that's a great question. And a simple, overly simplified answer to that is we have to take ourselves off of this hook of actually kind of seeing ourselves as being responsible for, how people are dealing with this. We got to, and I'll be simple here. We've got to let God be God in these situations, rather than we kind of assume that responsibility role, And that's where guilt sometimes comes, because I am the one who is supposed to be able to make all this right. And the truth is, we're just carriers of that. And so that's a great question. There's a complex kind of thing.
Great. Well, Bob, again, thank you for spending time with us today. We really appreciate
my
it.
pleasure.
I'm hopeful that Greg can send you some of the terrific questions on the chat room that we didn't get a chance to address today, and maybe you can address those for us.
I'd be
another
happy
format.
to, and to pass on any resources. I mean, we're all resources to each other, but it's been my honor to be a part of. I salute every one of you and keep you in my prayers.
Thank you for that, Bob. I'm going to turn this now over to Kevin for a couple of final comments before Ashley closes us in prayer. Kevin?
Oh, hold on a second. Technical difficulties. That is amazing. Speaking of trauma, Kevin, you sound like a mouse right now. So let's try this again. Ruth, let's punt here. Do you want to fill in Kevin's role or just go right to Ashley?
Oh my gosh, this is Kevin's nightmare. He becomes Mickey Mouse online every so often.
I swear I didn't do it.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Anyway, I just want to I think what Kevin would say is, with gratitude for the community, the reminder that we're in this together. I love the image of closing with, it's like the storm's going to happen. The storm is happening, and we have to learn to dance in the storm. And with that, my sister Ashley, bring us home.
Thanks, Ruth. Let's pray. Holy God, we're so grateful for Bob and for the wisdom of this entire community and for our time together today, and for moments of humor that you grace us with, even in the midst of crisis and trauma. Lord, for those who need peace today, send them peace. For those who need relief from guilt for not being able to do enough, allow them to release that. For those who need 5 minutes of silence, may they find it. For those who need a conversation, may someone show up to share in their midst. For all of us, as we minister to those around us, may we be reminded to care for ourselves and to care for one another in this incredible, daunting task, and to lean on one another as this group that has so much to offer. And now let your servants go in peace, Lord, and may we continue your work and care for your people in the name of Jesus Christ, your Son. Amen.
Amen and amen. Thank you, everyone.
Amen.
And thank you for participating today. We'll be back on the same channel in another couple of weeks.